He was never supposed to stand watch over a grave with no name. Yet every morning at exactly 6:03 a.m., the German shepherd was already there. The first light over the outskirts of Fort Reynolds, Colorado, stretched thin and pale across the frozen ground, brushing against rows of unmarked markers that had long since been removed from official records. The air carried that quiet, weightless cold that makes even sound feel distant, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Staff Sergeant Michael Carter stepped out of the base vehicle and paused before he even closed the door, his eyes narrowing slightly as he saw the same silhouette he had seen for 3 days in a row. A German shepherd sat perfectly still in front of a single patch of earth, its posture rigid, its gaze fixed downward as though waiting for an answer that never came. Michael adjusted the collar of his jacket and began walking across the gravel path, boots pressing into the frost with a steady rhythm that broke the silence in small, deliberate cracks. The dog did not move, not even when he came within 10 feet. Only its ears shifted slightly, tracking him with quiet awareness, as if measuring intent rather than presence. Michael stopped a few feet behind it and looked down at the simple wooden marker. There was no name carved into it, no rank, no dates, only a small metal tag affixed to the base that had faded from exposure to weather and time. It was the kind of place that did not belong to memory or honor, but to something left unresolved. He crouched slightly, his breath visible in the cold air, and spoke in a low voice, careful not to disturb the stillness. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" The dog did not react in any obvious way, but something in its posture tightened, a subtle shift in the shoulders that suggested awareness rather than indifference. Michael studied it more closely now, noticing the worn leather collar around its neck, the edges frayed from time and exposure, yet still intact, still holding on as if refusing to be replaced. There was an engraved plate on it, dulled by scratches and dirt, and when the light shifted just right, he could make out partial letters. His expression changed almost imperceptibly as he leaned closer, reading slowly, as though the name itself resisted being spoken. Rex, K9 Unit 2-7. Handler, SGT, Aaron Vaughn. The moment the name settled in his mind, something inside Michael went still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Aaron Vaughn. The name belonged to someone he had not spoken aloud in years, someone tied to a mission file that had been quietly sealed and archived under circumstances no one ever fully explained. Michael straightened slowly, his eyes returning to the dog, and for the first time, he noticed the way Rex's gaze had shifted, not toward him, but toward the ground again, unwavering, as if guarding not just the place, but the absence itself. A distant wind moved across the field, brushing through the dry grass with a sound like whispered pages turning, and for a brief moment, Michael felt the weight of something unspoken pressing into the silence between them. He took a step closer to the grave, careful, measured, and Rex responded immediately, rising just enough to block the movement without aggression, only presence, only certainty. It was not a warning born of hostility, but of loyalty so deeply rooted it had become instinct. Michael stopped again, holding his hands slightly open to show he meant no intrusion. "I knew him," he said quietly, almost to himself, though the words seemed to settle heavier in the air than he intended. At that, Rex's ears tilted back ever so slightly, and for the first time, the dog looked at him directly. There was no confusion in that gaze, only recognition of something emotional, something unfinished. Michael felt a slow tightening in his chest as memories he had not expected to surface began to flicker at the edges of his thoughts. Brief images of training grounds, distant radio calls, and the steady voice of a man who always finished his sentences like they mattered. He exhaled slowly, looking back at the grave marker, and then again at the collar, as if trying to reconcile two truths that refused to align. The record said Aaron Vaughn had never returned. But Rex was here, waiting, guarding, as if the story had never actually ended, only paused at a point no one had been allowed to revisit. The realization did not arrive as shock, but as a quiet fracture in understanding, subtle and persistent, like ice beginning to crack beneath steady pressure. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, not because it was dark, but because the details now mattered in a way they hadn't before. He knelt again, this time beside the edge of the marker, and swept the light slowly across the ground. The beam revealed faint impressions in the soil, not recent, but not ancient either, as though something had been disturbed and then carefully returned to place. Rex shifted slightly, watching every movement, his body still anchored to the grave like it had learned the shape of permanence. Michael lowered the flashlight, his voice barely above a whisper now. "What are you still doing here, Rex?" The question hung without expectation of answer, yet the dog did not look away. In that moment, Michael understood something he could not yet fully articulate. This was not a place of endings. It was a place of waiting, and Rex had never been trained to leave his post. Not without command, not without truth. The silence around the grave did not break even after Michael Carter rose to his feet. It lingered, thick and unnatural, as if the entire field had learned to respect the stillness that Rex refused to abandon. The German shepherd had not moved an inch, yet everything about him felt alert, coiled beneath restraint, like a memory held too tightly for too long. Michael took a slow step backward, eyes never leaving the dog, and only then did he notice something he had missed before. The ground around the grave was not disturbed randomly. It was precise, almost deliberate, as though someone had returned to this exact spot repeatedly, not in grief alone, but in duty. A duty that had never been officially recorded. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the distant sound of a vehicle passing along the base perimeter road, but it felt muted here, as if the world beyond this small patch of earth had been placed behind glass. Michael adjusted his stance and spoke again, quieter this time, as though raising his voice might fracture something fragile. "This is not a registered burial site," he said, more to himself than to the dog. Rex finally turned his head slightly, acknowledging the words without responding to them, and in that subtle motion, Michael felt an unease settle deeper in his chest. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document, old and worn at the edges. It was not something he should have still had, but some files never fully left the hands of those who had signed them. The paper contained fragments of an incident report, one that had never been fully resolved, referring to Staff Sergeant Aaron Vaughn and his K-9 partner, Rex, last seen during a classified field operation that ended without extraction confirmation. The official line had always been simple: missing in action, presumed lost. But standing here, looking at the dog that refused to leave, Michael felt that simplicity unraveling. He looked back down at Rex. "You were there," he said slowly, the realization forming not as a question but as an acknowledgement. Rex rose slightly from his seated position, not aggressively, but enough to reposition himself between Michael and the grave again, as if the conversation itself was approaching a boundary it was not yet meant to cross. Michael did not step forward this time. Instead, he crouched at a respectful distance, studying the dog's posture, the tension in its shoulders, the way its eyes never drifted from the ground. There was something ritualistic about it now, something beyond training or instinct. It was remembrance, repeated until it became survival. A faint crunch of gravel behind him made Michael turn his head sharply. A base maintenance truck was passing at a distance, its tires scattering small stones along the road, but the sound faded quickly, swallowed by the open field. When he looked back, Rex had not moved, but the dog's gaze had shifted slightly, now angled toward the horizon beyond the grave, as if tracking something not visible to anyone else. Michael stood again, slowly this time, and exhaled through his nose, trying to organize thoughts that refused to align. The idea that Aaron Vaughn could be connected to this place in a way not reflected in any official record was not just unusual, it was impossible under standard procedure. Yet nothing about Rex suggested confusion. The dog was not lost. It was anchored. Michael stepped closer to the collar again, carefully, not reaching for it this time, but reading it under the shifting light. The engraving was clearer now, as though time itself had chosen to reveal it in stages. He noticed something new along the edge of the metal plate, a secondary marking partially worn away, possibly an identification code that had been deliberately scratched out. That detail changed the weight of everything he was seeing. This was not abandonment. It was removal, intentional and documented in a way that had never been meant for public eyes. Rex lowered his head slightly as Michael observed this, the movement subtle but heavy with meaning, like the dog understood the direction of thought, even if it could not interpret words. Michael spoke again, softer now, almost reluctant. "They told us there was no recovery." The words hung in the cold air, and for the first time, Rex made a sound, low and restrained, not a bark or growl, but something closer to a breath that carried weight. Michael felt it in his chest more than he heard it. He looked away from the collar and toward the grave once more, and the realization began to take shape fully. This was not a place marking the end of a life. It was a place marking the absence of truth. And Rex had been left here as the only constant in that absence, the only witness that never signed off, never relocated, never accepted the version of events that had been filed away. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the open field, and Michael stood in silence, no longer as someone investigating a site, but as someone standing at the edge of a story that had been waiting far longer than he had been ready to hear. Michael Carter remained still long after the wind had shifted again, as if the air itself had changed its direction of thought. Rex had not moved from the grave, but something in his posture had softened, not in surrender, but in recognition, as though the presence of Michael had triggered a memory the dog had long been holding in silence. The cold morning light had now fully settled across the field, revealing more detail in the terrain, more imperfections in the soil, more signs that this place had been visited repeatedly rather than forgotten. Michael took a slow step to the side, deliberately breaking the direct line between himself and Rex, trying to observe without interfering, and that was when he noticed it. The grass around the grave was flattened in narrow paths, not chaotic, but directional, like footsteps that had returned again and again to the same exact point. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the pattern, and for the first time, he felt the situation shift from mystery into something closer to procedure. This was not random mourning. This was ritualized presence. He exhaled slowly, then spoke in a tone that carried both caution and respect. Someone has been maintaining this place. Rex's ears tilted at the sound, but the dog still did not move, still anchored to the same position, as if even acknowledging the statement might disrupt something sacred. Michael reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a small handheld radio, turning it over in his palm without activating it. There was no signal requirement here, no urgency that demanded response, but habit was difficult to break. He considered calling in a request for historical records, but something told him that official answers would only repeat what he had already seen in files that did not align with what stood in front of him. Instead, he crouched again, this time closer to the edge of the grave, but still outside Rex's immediate boundary. The dog tracked every movement with calm intensity, never aggressive, only aware, like a sentinel that had learned patience through years of repetition. Michael spoke more gently now, lowering his voice to something almost conversational. "I am not here to take anything away from you." The words seemed to settle into the air rather than disturb it, and for a brief moment, Rex lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in something closer to acknowledgement. It was the first shift Michael had seen since arriving, subtle, but significant. He studied the collar again, focusing on the worn engraving, tracing the letters mentally as if reconstructing something that had been partially erased. The name Aaron Vaughn carried weight in his memory, but not because of rank or file classification. It carried weight because of absence, because of the silence that had followed it after the mission debriefs had ended. Michael slowly stood again, eyes moving from the collar to the grave, then beyond it toward the perimeter of the base where the land rose slightly into a ridge of pine and rock. Something about that direction felt intentional, like a point of origin that had never been fully accounted for. Rex finally shifted his position, not leaving the grave, but adjusting slightly so that he now faced Michael more directly. The movement felt deliberate, not reactive, as if the dog had decided that observation required acknowledgement. Michael met the gaze without hesitation, and in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them. It was not understanding in the human sense, but alignment, two presences recognizing the same unresolved truth from different ends of the same memory. Michael spoke again, slower now, each word measured. "You were not abandoned here, were you?" Rex did not respond in any conventional way, but the stillness that followed felt heavier, as if the question had landed exactly where it was meant to. The wind swept across the field once more, carrying with it the distant echo of base activity, faint and mechanical, but it felt separate now, detached from this small circle of silence. Michael looked down at the ground again, noticing now how carefully the soil had been preserved in its current state, not disturbed beyond necessity. Whoever had been here before had done so with intention, not neglect. He reached into his pocket and removed a small notebook, flipping it open but not writing yet, only observing. The pages were mostly blank, reserved for details that could not be reconciled through memory alone. He hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke one last time, almost to himself. If this is what I think it is, then nothing about your record is complete. Rex remained still, but his eyes followed Michael as he began to write the first line in the notebook. The act itself seemed to change the air between them, as if acknowledgement had shifted the nature of the moment from observation into continuation. The grave remained unchanged, the field remained silent, but the sense of permanence around them had subtly altered. Michael closed the notebook slowly, holding it for a moment before returning it to his pocket. He looked once more at Rex, and this time, the dog did not look away. The connection between them was not trust yet, but recognition of a shared uncertainty, a quiet agreement that the story here was not finished, only paused at a point where someone had stopped asking the right questions. The silence between Michael Carter and the German Shepherd had begun to change shape, no longer empty but layered, as if every second that passed was adding weight to something neither of them fully understood yet. Rex remained positioned near the grave, but his posture had shifted slightly, no longer rigid in absolute defense, but still deeply anchored, as though the boundary he was guarding had expanded to include Michael himself. The morning light had grown stronger now, casting longer shadows across the uneven ground, revealing faint depressions in the soil that suggested repeated visits over time. Michael stood a few feet away, hands relaxed at his sides, carefully observing without pressing forward. There was something about the way Rex's eyes tracked him now that felt different, less like resistance and more like evaluation, as if the dog was reconsidering the role of a stranger who had chosen not to leave. Michael exhaled slowly, then spoke in a steady, quiet tone. You have been alone here for a long time. Rex did not respond with movement, but the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly, an almost imperceptible release that suggested recognition of truth rather than agreement with words. Michael turned his gaze briefly toward the horizon again, where the base infrastructure faded into the distance, and for a moment, he considered the silence surrounding this entire location. There were no patrol markers, no official signage, nothing to indicate that this site was being actively monitored or even officially acknowledged. That absence was not accidental in his experience. Absence often meant control or concealment. He took a step to the left, carefully altering his position to observe the grave from another angle, and noticed something he had not seen before. Near the base of the wooden marker, partially obscured by frost and soil, there were faint impressions that looked like repeated placements of objects, small and consistent in spacing, as if something had been placed there regularly and removed just as carefully. Rex followed the movement with his eyes, but did not shift his position. Michael knelt again, this time closer to the ground, but still outside the immediate radius the dog had established. He extended a hand slightly, not toward Rex, but toward the soil itself, brushing away a thin layer of frost with his fingertips. Beneath it, he found fragments of disturbed earth that had been layered rather than scattered, suggesting intentional concealment rather than natural decay. His expression tightened slightly, not with fear, but with focus. This was maintained, he repeated quietly, almost confirming his own observation. At the sound of his voice, Rex finally moved, not forward or backward, but sideways, repositioning himself so that he now stood between Michael and the deeper side of the grave, reinforcing the boundary without aggression. The gesture was precise, disciplined, and deeply familiar. Michael recognized it immediately as trained behavior, not instinct alone, but structured response developed through repetition and command. He looked up at the dog again, studying him more carefully now. You are not just guarding this place, Michael said softly, more to himself than to Rex. You are maintaining protocol. The words hung in the air longer than expected, and for the first time, Rex's gaze broke away from the ground, locking onto Michael with a steadiness that felt almost human in its intensity. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint chill that moved across the field in slow waves, brushing through dry grass and empty space. Michael rose. Slowly, his mind beginning to assemble fragments that did not yet form a complete picture but refused to remain separate. A K-9 unit, a missing handler, an unmarked grave, repeated maintenance, and a dog that refused to abandon its post under conditions that no active directive should require. He reached into his pocket once more, retrieving his phone, but instead of calling, he simply held it, staring at the blank screen as if waiting for permission to proceed. After a long pause, he lowered it again. "Someone left you here with instructions," he said quietly. Rex did not respond, but the stillness that followed felt heavier, as if the dog had acknowledged the direction of the thought without needing to confirm it. Michael took one step closer than before, carefully testing the boundary. Rex did not growl or retreat, but his body remained positioned, alert, unwavering. It was not hostility that held him there. It was duty that had not been released. Michael stopped again, accepting the limit without challenge. In that moment, the grave no longer felt like a place of death or mystery alone. It felt like a site of unresolved command, where something had been intentionally paused and never formally concluded. And Rex, standing between memory and investigation, was the only living continuation of that unfinished order. Michael Carter stood still for a long moment after the realization settled deeper into his thoughts, as if the weight of what he was seeing had finally begun to press against something structural inside his understanding. The morning had fully matured now, sunlight spreading across the field in a soft but revealing wash, exposing details that earlier had been hidden beneath frost and shadow. Rex remained in place, unwavering, his body aligned with the grave as though the position itself was part of an unbroken instruction rather than a choice. Michael lowered his gaze slightly, studying the distance between the dog and the wooden marker, then the subtle symmetry of how Rex had positioned himself not only to guard the site, but to control access to it from every possible angle. It was precise in a way that went beyond grief or memory. It resembled procedure. He exhaled slowly, then spoke in a low, controlled voice. "This is not just guarding. This is structure." Rex did not react outwardly, but the slight shift of his ears suggested he was processing the tone more than the words. Michael took a cautious step backward, breaking his own proximity to the grave to observe the entire scene as a system rather than a moment. From this distance, the pattern became clearer. The worn paths in the grass formed repeated arcs of movement, consistent entry and exit points that implied someone or something had been returning here under a disciplined rhythm. There was nothing chaotic about it. Even nature seemed to have adapted around the repetition. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly as he began to map it mentally, aligning distances, angles, and positions the way he had been trained to analyze terrain during his service years. Rex finally shifted again, but only slightly, repositioning his front paws without breaking his focus. The dog was not reacting to Michael anymore. He was maintaining equilibrium with the environment itself, as though any disruption in spacing would violate an unspoken rule. Michael glanced again at the collar around Rex's neck. The engraved plate, though worn, still held the partial identification that had already altered everything he thought he understood. But now he noticed something else. Beneath the main engraving, there were micro-scratches, nearly invisible unless light struck at a precise angle. He crouched again slowly, adjusting his position until the sunlight revealed faint secondary markings embedded into the metal. They were not decorative. They were deliberate, structured codes, likely used for internal tracking or classification. Michael felt a subtle tightening in his chest as he recognized the implication. This was not an ordinary service collar. It had been modified beyond standard issue. "You were part of something classified," he said quietly, not expecting acknowledgement, but needing to articulate the realization. Rex did not move, but his eyes remained locked onto Michael, steady and unreadable. The wind passed through the field again, this time slightly stronger, bending the dry grass in synchronized waves that made the entire landscape feel like it was breathing. Michael stood once more, his attention now divided between the grave, the dog, and the invisible structure that seemed to connect them. He considered the possibility that Aaron Vaughn's status had been recorded incorrectly, not due to error, but due to classification control. That possibility shifted everything from mystery into intentional design. He took out his notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, as he wrote down what he could confirm. Unmarked grave, persistent K9 presence, repeated maintenance indicators, non-standard collar encoding, and absence of official perimeter designation. Each line added weight, not answers. Rex shifted slightly again, this time stepping half a pace forward, not toward Michael, but toward the grave itself, re-establishing dominance over the space as if the act of documentation itself required reaffirmation of control. Michael paused writing and looked up. "You are not confused," he said quietly. "You are maintaining something I have not been cleared to understand yet." The words were not accusation. They were recognition. For the first time, Rex lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in something closer to acknowledgement of shared awareness. It lasted only a second before the posture returned to stillness, but the moment had changed the dynamic between them. Michael closed the notebook halfway, not fully shutting it, as if leaving the thought open for continuation. He stepped back again, widening his view of the field. From this distance, the grave no longer appeared isolated. It appeared central, as if everything around it had been arranged to support its continued secrecy. And Rex, standing motionless in front of it, was not simply guarding memory or mourning absence. He was preserving order in a system that had never officially ended, only been left without witnesses except for him. Michael Carter stood still for a long moment after the realization settled deeper into his thoughts, as if the weight of what he was seeing had finally begun to press against something structural inside his understanding. The morning had fully matured now, sunlight spreading across the field in a soft but revealing wash, exposing details that earlier had been hidden beneath frost and shadow. Rex remained in place, unwavering, his body aligned with the grave as though the position itself was part of an unbroken instruction rather than a choice. Michael lowered his gaze slightly, studying the distance between the dog and the wooden marker, then the subtle symmetry of how Rex had positioned himself not only to guard the site, but to control access to it from every possible angle. It was precise in a way that went beyond grief or memory. It resembled procedure. He exhaled slowly, then spoke in a low, controlled voice. "This is not just guarding. This is structure." Rex did not react outwardly, but the slight shift of his ears suggested he was processing the tone more than the words. Michael took a cautious step backward, breaking his own proximity to the grave to observe the entire scene as a system rather than a moment. From this distance, the pattern became clearer. The worn paths in the grass formed repeated arcs of movement, consistent entry and exit points that implied someone or something had been returning here under a disciplined rhythm. There was nothing chaotic about it. Even nature seemed to have adapted around the repetition. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly as he began to map it mentally, aligning distances, angles, and positions the way he had been trained to analyze terrain during his service years. Rex finally shifted again, but only slightly, repositioning his front paws without breaking his focus. The dog was not reacting to Michael anymore. He was maintaining equilibrium with the environment itself, as though any disruption in spacing would violate an unspoken rule. Michael glanced again at the collar around Rex's neck. The engraved plate, though worn, still held the partial identification that had already altered everything he thought he understood. But now he noticed something else. Beneath the main engraving, there were micro-scratches, nearly invisible unless light struck at a precise angle. He crouched again slowly, adjusting his position until the sunlight revealed faint secondary markings embedded into the metal. They were not decorative. They were deliberate, structured codes, likely used for internal tracking or classification. Michael felt a subtle tightening in his chest as he recognized the implication. This was not an ordinary service collar. It had been modified beyond standard issue. "You were part of something classified," he said quietly, not expecting acknowledgement, but needing to articulate the realization. Rex did not move, but his eyes remained locked onto Michael, steady and unreadable. The wind passed through the field again, this time slightly stronger, bending the dry grass in synchronized waves that made the entire landscape feel like it was breathing. Michael stood once more, his attention now divided between the grave, the dog, and the invisible structure that seemed to connect them. He considered the possibility that Aaron Vaughn's status had been recorded incorrectly, not due to error, but due to classification control. That possibility shifted everything from mystery into intentional design. He took out his notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, as he wrote down what he could confirm. Unmarked grave, persistent K9 presence, repeated maintenance indicators, non-standard collar encoding, and absence of official perimeter designation. Each line added weight, not answers. Rex shifted slightly again, this time stepping half a pace forward, not toward Michael, but toward the grave itself, re-establishing dominance over the space as if the act of documentation itself required reaffirmation of control. Michael paused writing and looked up. "You are not confused," he said quietly. "You are maintaining something I have not been cleared to understand yet." The words were not accusation. They were recognition. For the first time, Rex lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in something closer to acknowledgement of shared awareness. It lasted only a second before the posture returned to stillness, but the moment had changed the dynamic between them. Michael closed the notebook halfway, not fully shutting it, as if leaving the thought open. For continuation, he stepped back again, widening his view of the field. From this distance, the grave no longer appeared isolated. It appeared central, as if everything around it had been arranged to support its continued secrecy. And Rex, standing motionless in front of it, was not simply guarding memory or mourning absence. He was preserving order in a system that had never officially ended, only been left without witnesses except for him. Michael Carter stood frozen for a brief moment as the weight of everything he had uncovered began to settle deeper than thought, deeper than logic, into something closer to instinct. Rex remained in front of the grave, unmoving, but the stillness around him was no longer empty. It felt charged, like the air before a storm that had not yet decided whether to break. The morning light had fully taken over the field now, stretching across the uneven terrain and revealing every detail with an uncomfortable honesty. Michael slowly exhaled, then lowered his gaze back to the ground near the wooden marker. The faint impressions he had noticed earlier were now clearer under the stronger light. They were not random disturbances. They were consistent, repeated, almost ritualistic in spacing and direction. Something had been placed here, removed, and replaced again in a pattern that suggested discipline rather than memory alone. Rex shifted slightly, adjusting his stance without breaking eye contact with the ground. Michael studied him carefully now, noticing how the dog's focus never drifted, never weakened, as if the act of guarding was not just physical but procedural. He spoke softly, almost carefully, as though speaking too firmly might disrupt something delicate. "You have been maintaining this site according to instruction." The words did not change Rex's outward posture, but something subtle passed through his presence, a faint acknowledgement in the way his ears angled ever so slightly. Michael took a step closer than before, stopping just outside the invisible boundary Rex had been enforcing since his arrival. The dog did not react aggressively, but his position adjusted immediately, re-establishing balance between access and restriction. It was controlled, precise, and unmistakably trained. Michael's eyes moved back to the collar, focusing again on the faint secondary markings beneath the main engraving. Under the clearer light, the hidden codes were more legible now, suggesting classification beyond standard K9 identification. He felt a tightening in his thoughts as he connected what he was seeing with what little he knew of restricted operational protocols. This was not a simple service animal assignment. This was structured containment of information through a living asset. He lowered his voice again. "You were assigned here for continuity, not abandonment." At that statement, Rex finally shifted his head slightly, not toward Michael, but toward the horizon beyond the grave, as if confirming that direction mattered more than words. The wind moved across the field again, stronger now, brushing through the dry grass in slow waves that seemed to echo the rhythm of something unspoken. Michael reached into his jacket and removed his notebook once more, opening it carefully. His handwriting was slower now, more deliberate, as he added new observations that changed the framework of everything he had written before. Maintenance pattern suggests ongoing protocol. K9 presence indicates active assignment retention. Site is not abandoned, but preserved under non-disclosed directive. Each line added weight rather than clarity. Rex remained still as Michael wrote, but the space between them felt different now, less like investigation and more like shared proximity to something neither fully controlled. When Michael finished writing, He did not close the notebook immediately. Instead, he looked at Rex again, studying him with a quieter understanding. "You are not waiting for permission," he said softly. "You are waiting for completion." For a moment, nothing moved. Then Rex lowered his head slightly toward the ground, not in defeat, but in confirmation of presence, as if acknowledging that time itself had not yet released him from his duty. The gesture lasted only briefly before he returned to stillness, but it changed the atmosphere completely. Michael closed the notebook slowly and slipped it back into his pocket. He stepped back again, widening the space between himself and the grave. And in doing so, he finally saw the full structure of what had been hidden in plain sight. This was not a place of loss alone. It was a system paused mid-execution, and Rex was not guarding what was gone. He was preserving what had never been officially allowed to end. Michael Carter stood with the notebook still resting in his hand, the pages now filled with observations that no longer felt like notes, but like fragments of a truth slowly assembling itself. The wind had softened again over the field, carrying with it a quiet stillness that felt different from before, less like concealment and more like resolution waiting to happen. Rex remained in position, but something in his posture had changed. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a slight easing of tension in the shoulders that had carried the weight of years without relief. Michael looked at him carefully, no longer as an observer trying to decode a mystery, but as someone standing at the edge of a responsibility he was beginning to understand. He took a slow step forward, careful not to cross the boundary too quickly, and when Rex did not respond with resistance, he took another. The space between them closed gradually, not through force, but through permission that had not been spoken aloud. Michael stopped a few feet from the grave marker, his eyes moving from the wooden surface to the collar around Rex's neck. The engraved name, partially worn yet still visible, now felt less like identification and more like a connection point between past instruction and present reality. He lowered his voice, steady but calm. "Whatever you were ordered to preserve, you have held it longer than anyone should have been asked to." At those words, Rex finally moved. Not away, not toward the grave, but toward Michael. It was slow, deliberate, and controlled, as though each step required the confirmation of purpose rather than impulse. Michael did not move back. He simply waited, letting the distance close until the dog stood just within arm's reach. The German shepherd paused there, then turned his head, slightly, looking not at the grave anymore, but at Michael himself. There was no confusion in his gaze, only a release of burden that had been carried far beyond its intended duration. Michael slowly knelt, bringing himself closer to the level of the dog, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The field around them seemed to hold its breath again, but this time it was different. It was not waiting for discovery. It was waiting for completion. Michael spoke softly, almost like an acknowledgement rather than a question. "You were never abandoned. You were never without purpose. You were held in place by instruction that outlived its meaning." Rex lowered his head slightly, and this time the motion was not defensive or alert. It was release, a long, measured lowering of something that had been carried too long in silence. Michael reached out slowly, not grabbing, not commanding, but placing his hand gently near the collar without pulling it. The dog did not resist. Instead, he remained still, allowing the contact as if it confirmed what had already been understood without words. Michael exhaled slowly, then looked back at the grave. The soil, the marker, the repeated impressions in the ground all now formed a single picture in his mind. This was not a burial site in the traditional sense. It was a preserved point of reference, a location maintained not for mourning, but for continuity of command. And Rex had been the living mechanism that ensured it remained intact. Michael's voice was quieter now, steady and certain. "If there is no further instruction, then I am here now." The words did not echo, but they seemed to settle into the space between them with finality. Rex lifted his head slightly at that, looking at Michael once more, and this time the gaze held something different. Not uncertainty, not duty, but recognition that the chain of waiting had reached its final point. The wind moved gently across the field again, but there was no tension in it anymore. Michael slowly stood, keeping his hand near the dog for a moment longer before letting it fall naturally to his side. Rex stepped forward once more, not away from the grave, but turning his body fully toward Michael. Then, with a calmness that felt almost ceremonial, He took his final step away from the marked ground he had guarded for so long. The distance did not feel like abandonment. It felt like release. Michael turned slightly and began walking beside him, not leading, not following, but moving together in the same direction as the field behind them slowly faded into silence. The grave remained, unchanged, but no longer watched. And for the first time, the duty that had bound one living witness to an unfinished past finally dissolved into something quieter, something complete, something that no longer required guarding to remain true.